new format. Stacey, I think you kick off.
Great. Okay. Can you still hear us okay? Uh-oh. Can you hear us?
Stacey, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, great. Well, good evening or afternoon, everyone, or good morning, if you're listening in from the US this morning. My name is Stacey Smedley. I'm currently the Executive Director of Building Transparency, and I'm honored to be here this morning to moderate a panel of a group of what I would call embodied carbon and construction decarbonization rock stars this morning from Seattle, Washington, where I sit. So we're going to start with just a brief round of introductions. The goal of the panel today is really to help everyone understand that there is work going on around decarbonization when it comes to procurement and the role of procurement in providing accessibility to the data we need to make informed decisions and really push the construction sector to decarbonize the heavy emitting materials that we work with every day. So with that, I'm going to just turn over to the first question. I'll call the panelists out by name. We've got a large panel, so I want to give everyone time to introduce themselves. So I'll start with Katie, and if you could just give us a little information about yourself and your organization, your role at Microsoft, and just spend a couple of minutes explaining how you fit into this decarbonization ecosystem when it comes to the construction sector in your work.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thrilled to be with you today. As Stacey mentioned, my name is Katie Ross, and I lead sustainability for Microsoft's real estate. Microsoft has a long-standing commitment to sustainability. We have been carbon neutral since 2012 and have been focusing on renewable energy, green buildings, how we think about our data center energy usage. But in 2020, we stepped back and asked ourselves the question, are we doing enough? And the answer was an unequivocal no. We are not doing enough. Society is not doing enough. So we set out to set new goals that really aligned with not only where science tells us we need to be, but also we had the recognition that those of us who can go further faster need to have the responsibility to. One of the key findings with our carbon negative commitment that was made in 2020 was we had been accounting for scope 1 and 2 and air travel only in our previous carbon neutral target. But an outside percentage, like every other company, is in scope 3. So for context, in 2021, Microsoft emitted 14 million metric tons of carbon. About 120,000 were in scope 1, a little under 5 million were in scope 2, and the remaining almost 13 million were in scope 3. So how does that fit into building decarbonization? So as my role in leading sustainability, we have about 14 million square feet globally. 38 million square feet globally. 14 million of that is in our headquarters in Puget Sound. And we are embarking on a major refresh of that campus, building 17 new buildings, about 3 million square feet of real estate. And so we sat back and thought, well, what does that mean from scope 1 and 2, ensuring electrification, but more importantly, given the numbers, what does that mean for scope 3? And that's when when we started engaging with building transparency in EC3 to really digitize the data, democratize the data to ensure that we have the information that we need to have when we're making procurement decisions to empower our development managers, our decision makers on the Microsoft side to say, pick this material, not this material, because of the carbon intensity, and also daylighting the decisions that will have the most impact. So not necessarily looking at every doorknob and screw and saying let's think about it from a carbon intensity perspective, but where are we going to have our biggest impact and therefore put capital behind that. So that's really the beginning of the journey that Microsoft has been on, which we started in the embodied carbon and construction space in 2018. We are on track right now to reduce our carbon emissions on that project by over 30%. For embodied carbon. and are also pursuing ILFI's zero carbon certification and have had a lot of success using sort of a carbon cap to demand sort of, or within our supply chain, EPDs and transparency, as well as C reductions on our project. I'll hand it back to you, Stacey.
Great, thanks, Katie. Hey, Andrew, I'm going to have you go next just to mix it up between the in-person and the virtual participants.
Okay, Stacey, thanks so much. So I'm Andrew Minson. I'm responsible for concrete and sustainable construction at the Global Cement and Concrete Association. So what has our association been doing? Well, first of all, who are they? They are represent the majority of cement production globally outside China, and we've got 3 of the biggest members from within China. And they came together at the end of last year to launch a global roadmap to net zero concrete. Now, there's lots of those sorts of things launched. Why do I mention ours? Why does it matter? Well, the first thing is actually we hope to launch it probably 6 months prior to launching it, because it took us that long to convince the CEOs and work with them to actually commit to it. So it's not just a report that sits on the shelf and is dusty. It's something that the CEOs have committed to, and it gives not only the technology levers, but it also gives the policy asks on how we're going to get to net zero concrete. And the policy asks, that leads us to the topic of today on procurement, because one of those policy asks is something that might be surprising to people, might be surprising to people who looked at the industry 10 years ago. It's that the industry want low carbon procurement. They want that demand signal for them to invest and develop their low carbon solutions, and for there to be a market for those low carbon solutions. So I've been involved in that roadmap, and we're now taking that from a global roadmap to national roadmaps. This week we were delighted to help launch the Thailand roadmap, which we've just, as a global level, just been acting as a catalyst with the Thai cement industry acting in concert with the Thai government. And we've got similar roadmaps being developed in India, Egypt, and Colombia and Brazil. And we're launching a whole series of other roadmaps in the coming months. Probably 8 to 10 countries in Africa, where we are obviously today, a couple in South America, and we're looking to some major populated countries in Southeast Asia to launch at the beginning of next year. All of which will include the policy asks, all of which will be looking for low carbon procurement. So that's one thing that I do. The other thing is we've got an EPD tool that Luca on my right is from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the GCCA was born out of work that came under the WBCSD, the CSI, and the EPD tool that we inherited, a legacy item. We've continued to develop that, and that EPD tool enables the industry to develop code-compliant EPDs to the codes in Europe, which are used pretty much around the world, apart from North America, where there's a different code. So we've got 2 versions of the tool, and that enables cement and concrete producers to put their EPDs into the marketplace, to be able to be used by themselves in developing their products, to be able to be used by designers and architects to compare different concrete products, and also to be used in procurement, private or public. Thank you very much for having me on this panel, Stacey.
It's good to see you, even if it's virtually, Andrew. I'm going to go to Luca next, since you mentioned the work at WBCSD.
Hi everyone, my name is Luca De Giovanetti. I work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I lead the work on decarbonization and circularity of the built environment. So obviously they go very well together, because one is a key enabler to achieve the decarbonization. So at WBCSD we represent 230 of the largest company, and working together with them on achieving the sustainability of and achieving the sustainability in the climate, nature, and inequality, addressing this key imperative. And building is one of the key systems that we are working. And the idea is obviously that we look at the built environment as a whole system, making sure that we take into consideration all players that are from the material, the manufacturing, construction, engineering, real estate, property developer, and but also the financial institution, investor, to make sure that we all together works together, because the built environment is responsible for 40% of the global CO2 emissions, and this is where the size of the challenge, but also where the opportunity lays. And I think also what we important to mention is what we want to achieve. What we need is that we need to halve emission in the built environment by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And to achieve that, we need to make sure that all buildings are, by 2030, all buildings are net zero in operation and at 40 to 50% embodied carbon reduction. So this is very much kind of part of our work that we do with all our members. And not only the members, but also the organization that we collaborate, because this is not something that, that is something that we need to do all together. And with that, that's when one part to demonstrate what these figures are is the work we did last year with Arup to provide measures and information of what it is. What do we speak when we look at the whole life carbon? How big is the challenge? But then providing data to understand where do we stand and where we need to go. So with Arup, we did the Where Do We Stand report. They're really looking at the whole life carbon emission of buildings. And then what we are doing now is to work on providing solutions to demonstrate that we can and we have to reduce the emission, halving emission on embodied carbon, but we can do it today. Solution already exists, so we want to provide evidence for that. And with Stacy and other companies as well, we're working on the importance of data and digitalization. So because we need to provide data to make sure that we do the right decisions and quantitatively decision. We need to standardize the way we look at the emissions in buildings. So look at making sure that we look at the whole life carbon in the same way, so that in the US is the same as in Europe and is the same as in Asia, and making sure that that's where we look, and that's where the building system carbon framework plays a role. And how we make sure the data are transferred from where do we have them, like EPDs, and goes them along the way, along the value chain, and enable design and construction to be in the right way and enable to decarbonize as much as possible. Hopefully it was not too long as an introduction, but probably I said most.
No, that was great. All right, Vina, we're going to go back to you online.
Hi, hi everyone, and thank you to you, Stacy, and the organizers for hosting this valuable discussion. So my name is Fiona Skinner. I work for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which is the secretariat of the Clean Energy Ministerial's Industrial Decarbonization Initiative, also known as the IDDI. So the IDDI is a coalition of governments and the private sector and other entities working to decarbonize heavy industry, starting with steel, cement, and concrete. I'm going to take this opportunity as well to reiterate some of the announcements that came out this week, actually, relating to more governments joining the initiative. So we had Sweden and Japan earlier this week joining our initiative, which means that we are now up to 9 countries that are members of this initiative and counting. So hopefully more announcements soon. But essentially, we're aiming to create thriving markets for these low carbon industrial products. On the one hand, by creating an enabling environment through the harmonization of standards, but also on data transparency and reporting mechanisms on embodied carbon. And then on the other hand, by harnessing the power of demand, particularly through public procurement. So one of the key pillars through which we're trying to create these thriving markets is really by emphasizing political will in green public procurement. So public procurement can represent anywhere from 25 to 45% of national markets for steel and cement. And so it's a very, very powerful tool and signal through which to create these markets and really signal demand. Using government purchasing power to switch to low carbon steel and cement really sends that much needed signal to encourage the levels of investment and innovation as well required to create thriving low carbon market. And essentially, if we see more governments committing to these targets, then that's a huge signal for the private sector to come in and bring in the investment needed for projects required for the transformation of these sectors. And so that's why we launched a Green Public Procurement Pledge that was launched at COP26 last year, actually, but updated in September at the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh. And it has 4 levels that build on one another. I think I'll have more opportunity to go into detail on the pledge later. But essentially, it relates to disclosure and procurement commitments that we're asking for from governments. And so that's a summary of some of the key aspects of the work that we're doing here at the IDDI. And I'll stop there and allow my other panelists to introduce themselves as well.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. And May, we'll end with you.
Yes, thank you.
For introductions.
Yes, my name is May Elwani. I'm the co-founder and chief strategy officer for EPD Egypt. And EPD Egypt is a licensee of EPD International. And EPD is the Environmental Product Declaration, which basically, thank you for making my case, because this is a business case, actually. So what does the EPD is a declaration of the product on a product level on the environmental impact of any kind of product, 1,000 of them. And one product like concrete and cement also can have different components, depends on their characteristics. And they measure the impact on both soil, water, and air through massive data sets that are measured and analyzed. And at the end, which is the objective of that panel as well, is to give an informative, sufficient, informative, and validated decision-making potential to the clients to know which material they should use that have a better climate impact in their construction process. So that would be, in a nutshell, Stacy. So I would not burn the rest of the conversation for my other colleagues. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you, May. What you're doing is very important, and we're excited to see it spread to Egypt. So we're happy to have you on the panel. So I'm going to jump into the next question. And this is really, I think, picking up on a couple of things that were said in introductions to Luca's point about digitization. How does accessibility to manufacturer and product level data through the lens of environmental product declarations or other ways play a role in enabling these procurement policies to be implemented? And Katie, I might start with you just on how that's played out for Microsoft, and then I'll move on to the other panelists. Oh, you're muted, Katie, sorry.
Thank you. I knew I was going to do that at least once today. It's incredibly important. If you think about what Microsoft focus on in terms of data digitization and also just ensuring that everyone has access to that data, it's such a critical element. We all in the sustainability world have talked for many, many years on you can't manage what you don't measure. But in the built environment and construction materials, we really have not made, I think we are now making substantial strides in having that data at the ready when we make decisions, but it wasn't a factor, even 5 or 6 years ago as we were making design decisions in a quantitative measure. We knew certain materials, reusing buildings would always be a more sustainable way, a less carbon intensive way to design. But when it went down to tactically picking one steel over another or one cement over another, we really didn't have the data at the ready. And so that's where building transparency in EC3 has really changed the game for us, and why we were committed as a founding funder and the first corporate pilot of that tool. Number one, because it's a free to use tool. And we think that that's an incredibly important aspect of scaling our climate commitments. If we meet our climate commitments and no one else does, we have not done what we need to do. So ensuring that this is something that can be used by everyone. And I think the other component for us was so many of these decisions, when we think about upfront carbon or embodied carbon, are the opposite of what we have done in the operational carbon space. The operational carbon space, there is always opportunity to change an operation. There is always opportunity to reduce your energy usage, to change your fuel sourcing. When you, from an embodied carbon, you buy the material and it's done. There's no redo button. And so it changes our design process so significantly, where we're looking at, not only the structural components and how that works with our workplace design and how that works within sourcing of just supply chain, ensuring that we can get the materials. We're obviously looking at cost and schedule, but how do we have that information at the ready at each design decision? So that's something that, or procurement decision. So that's something that we've worked with our general contractors who, when they give us bid summaries, they include costs, schedule implications, maintenance requirements, and carbon intensity in each triple bid. So we know if we pick this material, it might be a little bit more expensive, but it has a significantly lower carbon intensity. In many cases, especially for the structural materials, we did not find a significant cost premium. It was just about picking A versus B. And that was such a powerful tool also for our teams. If we think about scaling sustainability, we all work in sustainability, have that in our title, but it really is going to take everyone in the construction industry to understand these metrics and use them to make better decisions. I cannot be in every single design decision meeting saying pick the lowest embodied carbon. So that's the other powerful side, I think, to providing EPDs at procurement decisions and having that data in hand, is that the entire team, of the 3 million square feet and 5 dev managers and 5 different architects and the appropriate amount of subcontractors for a job of that size are all looking at, oh, what is the environmental product declaration? What is the global warming potential of this material? What is that impact to the total building model, and how do we reduce it? So it's been an absolutely transformational way for us to think about design. It's scaled to being used at all of our global projects, both on the data center side and the real estate side. And it really enables us to have those conversations. And I think, Andrew, as you pointed out, it takes the demand side for us to say, we need this information from day one to make better decisions so that we can prioritize lower embodied carbon materials. And so I think it really does start with owners requiring EPDs instead of sending that market signal.
I'll go to Andrew next, Katie, since you kind of pointed out at the other end of the scale. Andrew, how important is it that this data that we're trying to provide, that the owners are starting to ask for, that policies are starting to require, how important is that digitization part of the equation of being able to access and create this data and move it around into the tools and places it needs to go?
I'm gonna hope I remember that question, because I just wanted to pick up a little bit of what Katie said first, if I may, and then I'll move on to digitization. So I think, Katie, from what you said, and it's always terrible to try and summarize what someone else has said, but so I work for material industry, but I'm a structural engineer. So you talked about design and procurement. So as a structural engineer, if I've got the data on different concretes, and you made the point that some product, many products, it's not just one product. Concrete, there's hundreds, thousands of different concretes. So as a designer, you've got the opportunity of choosing your vertical structure, your columns. It might be 60 units of strength, or it might be 40 units of strength. If it's only 40 units of strength, you've actually got a bigger volume of concrete. But the 40 unit of strength concrete probably has a lower CO2. But what's the trade-off between the volume increase and the CO2 reduction? Well, without the data, you can't do that calculation. So you need the data to be able to do that calculation to optimize the design for carbon. So typically designers will optimize for cost and for speed and for quality. And now we need to be optimizing for carbon. We've got really good data on cost, and the contractors will quickly tell you as a designer if you're designing something that's going to be slow to build, because that costs them money, and quality is important, and that's where the strength of your design team comes in. We need the data to be able to do the carbon story. And then once we've got the design, then obviously you're going to procure the materials, and you've chosen your 40 for this vertical structure, but you've chosen your 60 for this vertical structure. You can go to the marketplace and get from them and compare with their EPD data what their CO2 footprint is, and the other indicators, if they're important to you, for your 40 strength concrete that you might be using somewhere and your 60 strength concrete somewhere else. So I mean, you just have to have the data. So the digitization means that it's going to be quicker and easier and cheaper. So one of the barriers is the expense of doing EPDs. So you talk to manufacturers, and I know there's some in the room, the cost of EPDs is for some prohibitive to be able to do that. And if we can digitize the process, we can reduce the cost. and Stacey very kindly asked me the question because we're in the process of finalising our new version of our tool that will give a digital output, which will speed this process. And we're also gone into collaboration with Athena Institute in North America to allow suppliers to produce on-demand EPDs, which will, so our tool automates some stages in the middle, and collaborating with Athena Institute, they've got a front end and a back end, which will mean the whole process has been digitized, which will reduce the cost down and therefore be able to ensure that manufacturers can provide more EPDs. And for a product like concrete that can be mixed differently today to tomorrow to the day after that, and it has such a spectrum of properties, it's valuable to us to be able to lower the cost through the digitization process.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Luca, I think I'll go to you next, since you mentioned this in your intro, and just you're looking at this through a slightly different lens in terms of how you categorize this data once you have it. So if you want to just talk a little bit briefly about that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think the importance is obviously to get the data, to get the final number for what we need, but also to look at the bigger picture. So we need all the material, all the component to make a building. So, and that's the final product. And what we need to do is to make sure that that building has the lowest embodied carbon, or operational carbon as well, for what we need. So we need a building that has where we can live, where we can operate, work, and so. And that's where then we need to look at the performance of the building in the way it is constructed, and how we make sure then we construct it with the lower embodied carbon in the way in the construction. So that's why then we need to make sure that it stands, and that the structure is made with the lowest material, resource efficiency. That's where it comes in, and that material is purchased with the lowest embodied carbon, so that at least the final results is that the carbon emission is at the lowest. And actually, one thing that I wanted to react with what Katie you said. I mean, indeed, the operational carbon you can change it after once you construct it. Actually, that change bring additional embodied carbon, because that change make us kind of have to do another purchase another element or another retrofit, and that brings additional embodied carbon. So it's really important. That's why we need to make sure that decisions are made with our whole life carbon perspective up front, so that we are looking really how do we maximize the perspective in the bigger pictures. About digitalization, I think actually I'm kind of stealing a bit from my panel yesterday, but actually, the idea of digitalization is obviously how do we make eventually the results easy to be done and fast. Because like if we do a calculation that takes 3 days of work, some 2 or 3 experts that need to calculate all the data to get one number at the end, nobody does it. We did that before from our side. We wanted to look at the whole life carbon data, and the results that we got, it is challenging. It is challenging. Digitalization, the discussion was that how we make sure that practically no effort needs to be done to get the final results that makes then the decisions. Because once we get the data of how much a building is, what is the carbon footprint of that building, then it enable kind of the procurement. In this case, like the procurement from property developer, investor, or and real estate to say, well, I want to construct a building that has the lowest embodied carbon because I have the figures. And then as well, investor can finance that building and maybe make preferential investment, because they say, well, I prefer to invest and give the money to the buildings that has contributing to achieve my goals, and therefore they can, by having this number, they can make the financial decision that enable the transformation. And when we get the confidence that we have these numbers, regulation can say, well, actually, if we have these numbers, we can already set what we don't want, and then they can also set threshold for say, well, above this level, this is not allowed, or above this level there is a penalty, or then on the contrary, is also say, well, if it meet lower levels, we can obviously favor that more. So it is a system that needs to change, but then with data we can trigger all these changes.
Great, thanks, Luca. And then May, I don't know, as new into this space, how is EPD Egypt thinking about this as you set up your program when it comes to the data that you're going to be creating and how it's structured?
Yes, thank you so much. But I would answer in multiple contexts because my colleagues here are giving very informative and innovative. You know, my head is racing now. So because I want to separate embodied carbon, which is EPD part in materials, and operational carbon because they are both important for building, you know, the whole life carbon cycle. So if we're talking about data, yes, data as EPD and the upstream input material, embodied carbon, yes, data is very important. But as we said, that so many characteristics. The problem is that you need to take in consideration the national context or the geographical location of each manufacturing process, because the beauty of EPDs or other methodologies, life cycle assessment methodology in general, which EPD uses, is that it is from cradle to grave. So they really need to have, what we're trying to do is to have all of the cycle is primary data. So it's not borrowed from similar products. It has to be this specific product of your concrete with the characteristics. So the process is very hard. And actually, you were with us on the EPD panel. We said that we want to forget about the challenge and try to build on what we have, or otherwise we'll be very disappointed. And we're working. But actually, you championing your area, your industry, your sector, your product is a big thing. And I would call on other steel, for example, to also have a champion that put together all what they need from data. Because really, EPD alone, if doesn't have a champion per product, and I applaud you for that, thank you so much, because you make it easier for us to collaborate and gather the data. On the others, I'm sorry, Stacy, I'm just, it's a very,
Go for it.
yeah, very
keep going.
comprehensive, yeah. On because now Luca said it's on the building level, so I'm just imagining the building now, not EPD alone. So on the operational carbon, on the other side, is like what Katie suggested. It's the design. Of course, it's different for Microsoft, but it's the building design. So there are so many ways to lower carbon in a design. So it's like ventilation, energy, air tightness. So there are so many other ways. So if we're talking on a building level, I think EPD with the architects can really work wonders, even in the event of lack of data. But definitely in the context of this panel, for procurement purposes, we will focus on the embodied carbon, and we're doing our best. But I think thanks for such an initiative and work you are doing. You're making it easier for us to give you the data on a primary level, not borrowed data.
Great. And I'm going to go into the next question and start with Fiona, so you can wrap in the digitization component, the data component, into the IDDI framework. So the next question is really around, can you provide examples of embodied carbon procurement policy through the work that your organizations are doing, or work that you're touching or seeing in the embodied carbon space? And Fiona, we'll start with you and the work that you're doing.
Sure, yeah. So I mentioned in my introduction the Green Public Procurement Pledge that was launched under the IDDI. So this is not really a policy per se, but it is a pledge that governments or subnational entities as well can commit to, and with the intent of it being translated into national policy following the commitment. So our pledge has 4 levels, and those levels of ambition really build on one another. So level 1 really relates to the disclosure of embodied carbon in cement, concrete, and steel procured for public construction projects by 2025. So this is really about getting to know where we stand, getting to know the numbers, making sure the numbers are right, getting that disclosure right, and then sort of level 2 talks to conducting whole project lifecycle assessments for all public construction projects, but then also achieving net zero emissions in all public construction projects by 2050. So this is really about aligning procurement targets with net zero targets, getting industrial policy to speak to climate policy, to speak to energy policy, to speak to procurement policy. So it's about getting that alignment across all sort of policy arenas. And then levels 3 and 4 are really about the specific procurement of cement, concrete, and steel. So level 3 is about requiring the procurement of low emissions cement, concrete, and steel in public construction projects. And we're really encouraging signatories to be as ambitious as possible under their national circumstances. And level 4 is about requiring the procurement of near zero emissions materials. So that's really about getting that breakthrough technology for signature projects to make sure to incentivize some of the technology that is not yet deployed at scale to send that demand signal for that technology. And so in September, we had 3 governments actually commit to holding national consultations on this pledge. They now have 1 year to decide on the level of ambition that they'd like to commit to, and then they will move to national implementation of that pledge in their policy. So yeah, that's the summary of sort of the work that we're doing on embodied carbon policy.
Great. Do you want to mention briefly the working groups that you have established to help with that?
Sure.
Because I think that really speaks to the different requirements of these types of policies.
Absolutely. So at the beginning of this year, in 2022, we launched 3 different working groups. So those really speak to the sort of 3 pillars that I mentioned in my introduction. So our first working group is on the data and reporting protocols on embodied carbon. The second working group speaks to low carbon standards. So there we're really talking about, so I'm not sure if we've lost the floor.
Fiona,
Can
we
you
can
all
still
hear
hear
us?
you. Fiona, we
Okay.
can still see you
Okay.
and hear you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Sorry, we just lost the view of the audience there. So the second working group is really working to sort of harmonize definitions of what low carbon products actually are. So what is green steel? What is green cement? To make sure that there's that clarity for procurers as well. So when they're procuring products, to understand what it is that they're actually procuring and making informed decisions on the products that they're procuring based on a sort of harmonized standard that defines these products. And then the third working group works on green procurement. So their main task was really to update this pledge to make sure that it had the correct level of ambition. So if you're too ambitious, then of course it's very difficult to get any countries to sign up to a pledge like this. But not ambitious enough will of course mean that we fail to reach our 2050 targets. So we brought together over 70 stakeholders in these working groups that meet on a monthly basis across private sector, trade associations, academia, think tanks, etc. And we've been very, very grateful for their support in this process.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Katie, I might go to you next just to talk a little bit about the North American perspective and what's going on both in private and public policy here in the US, what you've seen from the private side in your work and also the public side recently.
Yeah. So we, within Microsoft, as we sort of started piloting this on one large project, have been trying to determine how we scale this across all of our portfolio. So we have, as part of our carbon negative by 2030 commitment, a commitment to reduce our scope 3 emissions by more than half. And so a couple of key findings have happened as a result of this. Number one, as we've all been discussing, access to data, digitized data so that it's ready when you're ready to make the procurement decision or make the structural decision, as you were mentioning, Andrew. Such a great point. It has to be used throughout the process. But also most of the reporting that is happening right now is done via spend-based methodology, which is very complicated because as we spend more money on potentially better materials over time, we will publicly report that we are increasing our carbon emissions because that is the methodology that it is by and large used in this space. So one of the things that we've been focusing on quite heavily and are very close to finalizing is a process-based methodology for public reporting for scope 3 emissions, whereby we will be able to show the actual carbon emissions of the materials that we have selected via EC3 and the digital EPDs, rather than reporting an estimate based on spend. So it's, it starts getting very wonky very quickly as we think about, carbon math, but the math is very important. Understanding the complexities of this space and being able to show show the decreases over time based on actual data is where we need to mature to get. And so much of that is underpinned by having access to the data. Within a policy perspective at Microsoft, that is meaning that we have global sustainability standards already, where we have maximum thresholds for our interiors products. We've been working with our furniture manufacturers to ensure that they have EPDs so we can make decisions based on EPDs, which hopefully adds more and more detail into EC3 and more EPDs and categories for people who buy a lot of furniture like we do. And then I think, as I think about the North American perspective and policy, obviously we've seen with the IRA, there is a lot of money available or being granted now for the creation EPDs, for standardization of processes around embodied carbon reduction, federal government buy clean policies, as Fiona was mentioning. That's such a critical component. That is a majority of construction materials in the US are bought by the federal government. So as they implement procurement practices, thinking about embodied carbon, that we will see that sort of demand shift the supply, hopefully. And Stacey and I have talked about this for years, but as we think about building codes, we have an energy use intensity target for all of our buildings. How does that become an embodied carbon target for all of our buildings? And how does that change the way, as we've been talking about on this panel, it's a very different development process than anyone has used historically. You are thinking about whole life cycle carbon. You are thinking about, the mechanical systems that go in, the end of useful life. You're thinking about materials that are selected and making strategic decisions in a different manner than we were before. So I'm very excited to sort of see this continue in the States to be sort of a bedrock of how decision making happens within development, and also how that potentially drives some building reuse over construction, because we know that's going to be the lowest embodied carbon building is the building that is not built. And so thinking about how that sort of helps a reuse and adaptive reuse of existing building stock. So that's, I'm sure I missed some things, Stacey, but that's what's top of mind for me in the policy space, both on the private side and on the public side.
Yeah, that was great. I'll just make a definition of buy clean policy that Katie mentioned. That's policy that the US is putting out there at both the state and the federal level now that requires environmental product declarations for certain scopes of building materials. And then over time sets carbon intensity maximums or a labeling system to really drive public procurement to the lower carbon options. And there's funding for that in the Inflation Reduction Act here in the States that's been approved. I might go to Luca next. I can't see you anymore, Luca, but go to you next just to talk a little bit about the European perspective when it comes to policy. And if you could think about it through the lens of procurement, that would be great. I know there's also a lot going on when it comes to whole life carbon and whole building life cycle assessment.
I'm going to interrupt.
I see Andrew that want to
I'm
react to that,
desperate.
so give it first the word.
Oh, Andrew, go. I can't see you. So if
That's
you're shaking your arms around or something, go for it.
As Katie was talking, I was thinking I need to just put a plug. BCG, Boston Consulting Group, did a report published in May, June, that did a review through a WEF fellowship, so you'll find it on the web somehow. But it reviews different low carbon procurement methods that have been published, 4 or 5 in Europe, plus the buy clean one that Stacey just explained. So that gives a pretty good overview. Another shout out will be for the Institution of Structural Engineers in the UK, working alongside some other institutions. Like many countries, but not all countries, as we heard. I mean, in this very place we are now, the Buildings Breakthrough, the intent to do that was launched by the French government and the Kingdom of Morocco, and that's for low emissions and resilience. And low emissions is obviously whole life, and they pointed out that many countries don't have energy efficiency codes. The UK has an energy efficiency code, but they don't have an embodied code. So those professional institutions I mentioned have come up with something, and you'll be able to find this on the web as well, because it's called Part Z, as a sort of a working title of what a regulation using embodied carbon might look like, with a view that once they've got that, they can then harmonize that with the operational to then give the whole life, because obviously they're sometimes treated in silos, but obviously there's interaction between the two. The trivial example being double glazing. If we only focus on embodied, we'll end up with single glazing everywhere, and we'll have higher emissions from heating and cooling, which is obviously a nonsense. So we just need to make sure we join those two up. And there are other examples which maybe are not so self-evident, and therefore might be unforeseen consequences of separating into silos the embodied and the operational. So I've interrupted Luca, and you've now had time to think of your answer.
You should repeat the question, Stacey, because I
Sorry, no problem. And Andrew, that was a very important thing to interject, though, so I appreciate that, Andrew. So, Luca, I was just going to have you maybe talk just briefly about the policies that you're seeing in Europe around embodied carbon, particularly anything around procurement, but I know more broadly there's policies for whole life carbon and whole building life cycle assessments that are also in place.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe there is definitely a lot of happening with the various at EU level, with the assessment of, kind of looking at the different embodied carbon regulation, but also different countries setting their different procurement levels. But what I would actually say is that each country, they're moving into their own direction, and that's where I would say not much what is happening, but actually how it's happening is a bit the problem, because this lack of consistency, as I mentioned again, how we make sure that we look at the same problem in the same way would help everybody, would help company making products that meets the requirement, but also they can make sure that they don't have to look in which country this done. So they make sure that okay, what is done, speaking in Europe, what is done in France is the same as what is done in Denmark and the UK, or at least that is more comparable. And then of course this is Europe, but then US, maybe similar climate conditions would be one way, but Africa, Asia, so at least we can start to better understand what can be done, and then moving towards setting targets that are then in line with what we need for to bring us to the Paris Agreement. So science-based target, they are working now on setting trajectory for 1.5 for company to set target on their embodied carbon and operational carbon reduction. That helps to make sure that we move toward that direction. So so this is one thing. And what I wanted also to mention when we're speaking about the different procurement or kind of setting, kind of the procurement, I wanted to mention as well the work that the climate group is also doing, engaging with the private sector, with the Concrete Zero. And the idea is similar to the IDDI, so it's actually great because they are complementary, and that's actually targeting the private sector, making sure that the private sector set procurement requirement and set ambitious requirement on concrete. There is also steel zero, so making sure that trigger this demand for low carbon product that meet the same requirement. As you say, important is definitely to think about the strength. So we don't want to procure a lot of concrete just because it has a lower carbon content. Actually, we might need to look at the one with higher carbon content because it has the strength that we need to make sure that we need half of the concrete. So, but yeah, the Concrete Zero is also looking at the similar way that how do we halve, making sure that procurement are done 30% below the average, but also in the volume. So making sure that it's 30 to 50% of that volume in the future. So there is a lot of signals, and this is actually what is important. The private sector, the public sector, making sure that they leverage their power to drive the change, and making sure that the supply is then meeting that demand. So, and that's why strengthening this supply and demand dynamics is essential to drive the change.
Andrew, it looks like you want to jump in. Go for it. I can see you now.
I just should mention the third one. So the First Movers Coalition is another complementary one, in that they're looking further afield, but a much more stretched target. So a much more steep reduction, but some time frame to get there. So whereas IDDI and Concrete Zero are much more in the short term, so a lower reduction but affecting bigger volume. So that, very complementary, but the same principle of procurement and demand, encouraging and incentivizing and enabling the manufacturers to invest and decrease the carbon emissions in their processes.
Yep. Great. And May, I'm going to go to the next question, but I'm going to kind of fold this one in for you too, because I want you to speak to both. I think this is an important question because it's something that we're tackling with EC3 and seeing where the data is coming from when it comes to EPDs and where the gaps are. It seems, and I think this is true based on what the data shows us, that this product level disclosure via EPDs is currently mainly focused and has taken hold in the global north. So how do we ensure that the global south, where most of the construction is happening over the next few decades, is also engaged in this disclosure and has the information that they need for those projects that are coming? How do we help with that? How do we catalyze that? I know what you're doing explicitly is part of the answer to that. I'd love your perspective on that.
Yes, actually here I will borrow from both Fiona and Luca. I will be very optimistic about that. I think the pledge that have been launched will help that because, okay, I will take an example of Egypt. Egypt have two separate areas which are not silos, but they need to be connected as an example of the region. So we have the climate strategy already announced, and we have the green building codes announced. So what we're trying to do as a private sector is to put, not pressure, but is to push the demand so they can have an embodied carbon policy instead of just working in silos, because this is where we're focused in the built environment. So what we're trying to do now is to mobilize developers and mobilize consultants to all speak in the same voice. And this is actually what we're doing happening right now in Egypt. On the other hand, Africa, it's a larger problem. It's a different kind of challenge because a larger part of Africa, they might not need all this data gathering because they still build and live and breathe and they are happy in their own basic material. So some part of Africa, I would say, let them be. They don't have problem with the emission. They're just living with the nature-based solution. So, and this is also a part that we should not forget about. Maybe we should not worry about where people use nature-based solution and actually, encourage it, encourage resilience, and focus on certain countries in Africa who needs that. They live in urban cities that are progressing and growing very fast. But I can see initiatives like South Africa, 4 cities already in the net zero climate commitment and with C40. So I think we're moving ahead. To be honest, I cannot give concrete answer except for Egypt right now, but I promise you, by the time for COP28, we will have more data on the ground, tangible data, and this is what we hope to do. I also would like to borrow from Victoria Borrows in the morning. After the call for the building breakthrough, we had the implementation lab. I think, Luca, you were always there. And they said something very interesting. Is it the supply driving the demand, or the demand is driving the supply? And I think for the sake of this panel, I think the supply can drive the demand. It's not relevant in the bigger context about data, but maybe if we really focus on the supply side, then we can progress a green procurement really on the ground, helping Fiona to bring also a pressure from the developers on the governments to have policies on the ground. So, sorry, the reality of things, I'm just not trying to.
No, May, that was a great answer.
Yeah.
And I think the perspective that we shouldn't assume that everyone needs the same data everywhere based on how and what they built is very important. We can't just assume there's one golden solution that's going to work and put everyone in the same model for this. So thank you for mentioning that. Andrew, do you have any perspective on this from the role of the members that you're engaging with and how you're trying to spread that that kind of knowledge and commitment for concrete or cement?
Yeah, so we've got members around the world. So that would obviously include some of those developing regions that you mentioned, where there's a lot of informal construction. So not only the point that you made, but there's also the informal construction where we're a long way from this sort of data being used. I was on a panel the other day with some representing a gentleman who's representing the mayors of all of Malawi, and one of the things they're doing is actually giving awards to towns and cities where there's better ownership of land, because that is a stepping stone towards being able to do a whole lot of things one of which probably is what we're talking about today, being able to procure low carbon. But in his instance, it was things like drainage. So I think we need to recognize where people are on the journey and what challenges they've got where they are at. We've had some engagement with development banks who are interested in the procurement side of things, so that's quite interesting. So they've come to us and said, well, what about EPDs? What can your industry be doing on those? And the answer to that is that our members in those countries have access to our tool, our free tool, and so they can produce EPDs with that. There's a big capacity building issue. Someone yesterday from Morocco who was talking about just the capacity building in terms of LCA expertise, and we're still going through that in the global north, that term. So we need to expect that that's required elsewhere as well.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to do a popcorn question. Oh, Katie, do you have something you want to go ahead?
I was just going to add one of the things that we are thinking a lot about in this conversation of global north versus global south, and just where our reach is. Again, scope 1 and scope 2 happens in the sites that we own, in the communities that we are in. Scope 3 is supply chain. It happens everywhere, right? And so as we think about health impacts of the climate sort of emissions that happen, it's not all happening at our site. It's happening where our products are produced. And I think that perspective has very much changed how the importance of this work that we're doing in decarbonizing our full supply chain, because we are having an outsized impact in communities that we are not necessarily operating in. And I think that is the importance of this work, particularly as we think about the globalization of our supply chain. Perhaps in certain areas or certain markets, concrete is a very local decision, but steel or gypsum or ceiling tiles or furniture is not necessarily. And so I think that is a critical element to this full decarbonization, is to say where companies are procuring their supplies are not always where they're impacting the carbon emissions. And so how do we think differently and make sure that we are protecting not only the communities that we operate in, but also the communities that we're sourcing materials from. So I just wanted to add that in from a health perspective.
That's great. I think maybe we just, unless there's anyone else that has a burning comment, I'm looking to see if anyone's raising their hand. Oh, Fiona's raising her hand. One more comment, and then I'm going to put up the final slide, Fiona, as you go, because I think anyone on this panel is here to help and support anyone who's engaging in this work. And I'm going to say this without asking permission, but please reach out to any of us via LinkedIn if you're wanting to follow up with anything that was said on this panel today. And Fiona, you get to close now.
Fantastic. No, I mean, I think I just wanted to jump in on this as well. UNIDO, of course, is a development organization. We work a lot with developing and emerging economies, and really our primary mandate is to support inclusive and sustainable industrial decarbonization as well and development. So I think you raise a key point that this is an international challenge, and we need these first movers that are committing to these commitments, for example. But we can't do this alone, and we need to make sure that everyone is being included in this global dialogue. And in a sense, this is a great opportunity to do things right in some countries from the very beginning. It's a lot harder to change the status quo than to start from scratch. So I think we can also frame this as an opportunity to start things off on the right foot in certain places as well. And we can't set policies without data. We need holistic action at all levels to address things like awareness and capacity at on these things. And Andrew mentioned a key point that I just want to reiterate is that this process costs money, and especially when we're talking about smaller and medium-sized producers as well of these products, they have to make trade-offs every day on how they're going to spend their money. And so I think two actions that we need to work on collaboratively are the standardization of this process to make it simpler and ultimately cheaper, and also enhancing awareness of the data protocols and really reflecting the value of that data to everyone.
Great. Well, I couldn't have said it better than that to end the panel. So Fiona, thank you. Thank you to everyone, Katie, May, Andrew, Luca, Fiona, for joining us today, and for everyone that listened in person or online. And again, we are all here to help. We're in this together, and it is a global problem that needs global solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.